Next up, we've got another Leviathan type monster. This is the final of the Fated... Nope, never mind, I lied. Second to last Fated 4 monster from Generations. This is a Mizutsune. Mizutsune is sort of a light-colored bubble fox Leviathan. You fight it in the... Is it Misty Peaks? What's the name of the map? When you encounter Mizutsune, it'll attack by sort of sliding along the ground using this sort of soapy foam that it generates from its body. But it can also spit bubbles and jets of water. This is a really cool monster. I think it's probably my second favorite of the Fated 4. Very unique fight, really neat design. I'm going to put Mizutsune high A tier. I'm going to put it above Astalos. I think the whole bubble fox kind of yokai inspired aesthetic edges out the electric dragonfly a little bit. Again, like I said for the other Leviathans, if they can figure out the skeleton issues and put Mizutsune in a game, that'd be great. Given Rise very Japanese aesthetic, if they do that, I would be very surprised if Mizutsune doesn't show up in the next game. Next up, getting towards the end of the list, we've got the Deviant for Mizutsune. This is Soul Seer Mizutsune. From a lore perspective, it's a sort of older Mizutsune that lost its sight in battle, so it's blind, but it can sense. It's got sort of an extrasensory ability, so it can sort of still see, and its eyes glow when it gets mad. But Soul Seer is a more difficult version of the regular fight, and it has these foxfire bubbles that sort of fly and they can combust. Soul Seer is decently challenging. Like all the other Deviants, it's a lot of twists on the original formula, and I do like its design a lot. It's got sort of a darker color scheme, and then the glowing eyes when it's enraged are pretty cool. This Deviant stands out compared to some of the others, so I'm going to put it on upper B tier. I think I'm going to put it further up the list. Let's go above Shagaru Magala. Soul Seer is pretty cool. I liked fighting that monster, and it was decently challenging too. Next up, we've got 2 entries in a unique family that hasn't really seen much in recent games, and that's the Snake Wyvern family. The first to debut in Monster Hunter 4, 4th generation, is Najarala. Najarala is interesting. As the Snake Wyvern family name suggests, it's got a long serpentine body, sort of like the Leviathans, but it tends to be a bit more coiled and snake-like as opposed to more amphibious sea serpent type forms for the Leviathans. And Najarala is unique in that it has these different scales on its body that it can shoot out, and it uses its sonic roar, sort of like an echo sound wave, to explode its scales. The fight itself was pretty interesting. This monster was pretty unique in Generation 4. It moved really quickly, but because it had such a large body and tendency to coil around the player, it made it difficult to see because of the camera. But overall, I do like Najarala a lot. I think they could bring this monster back and sort of update its moveset and definitely give it a place in the current generations. So I'm going to put Najarala up on upper B tier. Its uniqueness helps it stand out. I'm going to put it behind Kurapeko. Again, if they do more snake-type wyverns or bring back the Najarala family, I think that'd be pretty cool in the later generation. The subspecies for Najarala is Tidal Najarala. This one, well, the original one doesn't have a specific element affinity. Tidal is water-based, and it behaves similar but can also use water projectiles. Throughout the fight, it'll scatter its scales around the field and use them as sort of like rebound reflectors to bounce its water projectiles. It's a pretty challenging fight, and I do like its design. Tidal Najarala, keeping up the trend of decent subspecies, I think I'm going to put it in the middle of B tier. Let's say above Drill Tusk. I think the design helps carry it a little bit more. The striking color patterns are pretty neat, and the fight itself is fine. It's definitely a decent challenge. Alright, it seems like the way the person who created this tier list divided things up did it primarily by monster family. Because now we're moving on to the Brute Wyverns, with the exception of this one here. First Brute Wyvern is Barroth. Barroth is pretty notable. Early tier target, debuted in Monster Hunter Tri. Sort of introduction to the faster moving monsters and learning how to avoid charging attacks and different monster tells. I like Barroth. I think it's interesting design. The fight itself is also manageable. It's not too difficult, not too easy. I'm going to put Barroth in B tier. I'm going to put it in lower B tier just because it's inoffensive, but I don't think it stands out a lot to really be in the upper tier. So we're going to put Barroth down here and put it above Puke. The subspecies, Jade Barroth, is an ice version of the regular one. It coats itself in ice and has a bunch of ice-based attacks. Overall, it's a pretty interesting twist on the fight. It's definitely more challenging than the regular Barroth. So I'm going to put the subspecies on B tier as well. I think I'm going to put it next to the original. I remember the first time it was introduced, it had a charging U-turn that surprised a lot of people. A couple notches higher in challenge, and overall I think the design for Jade Barroth is fine. So we'll put it up here on lower B tier. Next up we have another one of the great blank monsters from 3rd generation. This was Tri. This is Great Baggie. Great Baggie is the sleep version of the Great Blank monsters. And with Great Jaggy and Great Roggy up here, I think Great Baggie is fine, but I'm going to put it a little bit further down on B tier. Put it after Giganox. Aside from its sleep mechanic, Great Baggie didn't do too much. In the later games, when you fight this monster on G rank, they gave it, for some reason, they gave it an insane speed boost, and it became a real handful to deal with because of how quickly it moved. So while the other two pretty much had a linear difficulty curve, for some reason they made Great Baggie a lot more annoying. So I'm going to drop it down in the rankings here, but overall it's still a good design, so it'll sit on lower. Next up, we're going to go through all of the Brute Wyverns for a bit. First one is Eragon, another Monster Hunter 3rd generation debut. Ergon is fine. The Jay Leno monster, as it's called, usually found within the volcanic regions. Big sort of ore-covered beast that could roll around, cause earthquakes with its chin, and drop explosive rocks. The current generation version of Ergon in World was pretty much on par with the previous versions. They gave it some minor new attacks, but overall, Ergon's fine. I would put Eragon on upper C tier, primarily because while it is an interesting brute type, it doesn't really stand out, especially compared to some of the other ones on the list. So I'm going to put Eragon here after title. Next up is the deviant for Eragon, Crystalbeard. And I don't remember anything about Crystalbeard. It had a very similar moveset. Its armor was pretty desirable for the loot drop. Crystalbeard, for some reason, doesn't stick out in my memory at all. So even though it's a deviant, I'm going to drop it down here on C tier. I'm going to put it down here after Nightshade. Its coloring is interesting, and the fact that it's got all these gems on its chin, which is how it gets its name. I don't remember anything about that monster. And forgettability is never a good thing for the list here, so Crystalbeard goes down here. Next up, the subspecies for the regular Ergon. This is Steel Eragon. This one I definitely remember more about. It had a very similar moveset to the regular Eragon, but it primarily, what I remember it doing differently is that it had soiled status. It could fart on you, essentially. Had this big cloud that would inflict stinky status, which means you couldn't heal. And the rocks it dropped would do the same thing, I think. While I do remember more, it was not necessarily that interesting of a fight, but it did do some things differently, so I'm not going to drop it down too far on the list. I'll put it below Juratotis. Steel Ergon was different, but still not too memorable in my opinion. Not super high rank. Next up, we have the big daddy of the Brute Wyverns. We have the ever-hungry Deviljho. Deviljho is great. I like the idea of a big, green, hungry T-Rex that spits dragon breath. It is affectionately nicknamed the Pickle by the Monster Hunter community. In every game it's shown up in, Deviljho is always an invader type, sort of like Basil. Its tendency was to ruin your quests, but overall I do like its design, and its fight is decently challenging. So Deviljho goes up here on A tier. I'm going to put Deviljho above Basil as the OG invader, since Deviljho debuted in Monster Hunter Tri. And when this thing showed up, it was definitely a challenge and took a lot of people by surprise. Its variant, Savage Deviljho, takes all the things regular Deviljho did and made them 10 times worse. More damage, more speed, more dangerous breath attacks. It was more prone to pounce and pin. And when you made it angry, it's got this cloaking mane of dragon energy. Savage Deviljho, I think I would rate higher than the original, just based on its insanity factor. Still the same tier up on A. Great monster. Cooler design, more annoying fight, in my opinion. Best dealt with ranged weapons, from what I remember. Next up, we have the last of the Fated Four, for real this time. We've got Glabinus. Glabinus made its debut along with the other Fated Four in Monster Hunter Generations, and I go back and forth on which one is my favorite. I think Glabinus edges out Mizutsune for my favorite of the Fated Four flagships in that game. The idea of this big creature that has a tail like a great sword that it can hone and sharpen and then light on fire is such a unique concept, and definitely was memorable when it showed up in Generations. It's no surprise that Capcom chose Glabinus to represent that generation in Iceborne, and it was a real treat to see the monster come back. So I'm going to put Glabinus on S tier. Great monster, very unique design, very memorable. Definitely fitting of being the poster child. Deviant Hellblade Glabinus is still pretty nuts. I think it doesn't really have as much of the iconic factor, so I'm going to drop the Deviant down to B tier, but above Bolt Reaver Astalos, another Deviant. Hellblade was one of the upper tier Deviants in base Generations, and then these other ones like Soul Seer, Elder Frost, and Bolt Reaver were introduced in Generations Ultimate. Farming Hellblade Glabinus was a challenge, especially I think it was its powders that you had to get. But overall, it's basically the same fight with more dangerous attacks. I think it could do the big spin twice. A harder version of Glabinus, but doesn't quite match the iconic nature of the original. So it'll sit here on upper B tier. Still above average, good Deviant.